Kyeven Dorell was a man no one noticed, until Dalene Carlson vanished without a trace, and a single trail camera exposed the horrifying truth. He had no criminal record, no online presence, and no known enemies. To the outside world, Kyeven was just another quiet face in the crowd. But behind his silence was a predator who had perfected the art of disappearance, until one mistake shattered the illusion. Dalene Carlson's name would become the key to unlocking a chilling pattern of hidden crimes, buried secrets, and a killer who thought he had outsmarted everyone until the evidence stared back at him from the lens of a camera. Dalene Carlson was a quiet and ambitious 23-year-old veterinary student living in Montrose, California. She was the kind of person who kept her circle small but meaningful. Her life revolved around animals, her studies, and her part-time job at a small animal clinic. She lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment close to campus and rarely went out, except for groceries or occasional dinners with classmates. On the evening of August 27th, Dalene made a rare decision to unwind and visited a local bar named Timber Creek, a cozy place frequented by college students and regulars. It wasn't the kind of place where trouble brewed. People who knew Dalene were surprised she went out at all that night. She wasn't known for drinking or late-night outings. She arrived at the bar just after 9 p.m., parked her small sedan, and walked inside alone. Security footage showed her entering with a neutral expression, sitting at the bar, and ordering a soft drink. She stayed for a little over an hour. A few people tried to make small talk, but she didn't seem interested. At around 10:20 p.m., she stood up, glanced at her phone, and walked toward the exit. That was the last known sighting of Dalene Carlson. The next morning, her supervisor at the clinic noticed she hadn't shown up for her shift, which was unlike her. She never missed work without notice. Calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. By late afternoon, her friends began contacting each other, realizing no one had heard from her since the previous night. Her roommate, who had been away for the weekend, returned and found Dalene's room undisturbed. Her wallet, keys, and phone charger were still on her nightstand. The police were contacted the following morning, and a missing persons report was filed. Officers began with the basics. They checked the bar's security footage, spoke with employees, and reviewed any known surveillance from neighboring businesses. Dalene's car was still parked outside the bar. It was locked. Her purse was found on the front seat, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no witnesses to anything suspicious. It was as if she had walked into the night and vanished. Detectives combed through her phone records and found nothing out of the ordinary. No late-night texts or calls, no activity after she left the bar. Her social media accounts were inactive. They contacted her professors, friends, and coworkers. None of them had any insight. Dalene hadn't mentioned meeting anyone or feeling concerned. She had been focused on studying for an upcoming exam, and had even scheduled appointments with 3 pet owners for later that week. Everything in her life seemed normal. Except now, she was gone. The only potential lead came from a bartender, who mentioned a man sitting 2 stools away from Dalene that night. He didn't speak to her, but he seemed to be watching her closely. No one recognized him. He paid in cash and left minutes after Dalene did. The description was vague: mid-20s to early 30s, dark hoodie, jeans, baseball cap. Police began checking through known offenders and reviewing traffic cameras near the bar, but the footage was limited and unclear. The investigation was quiet for several days, and the public began to fear the worst. Flyers with Dalene's face were posted around the city. A reward was offered. Local news ran nightly updates. Her family pleaded for any information. And then, a few days later, the name Kyeven Dorell surfaced. One of Dalene's classmates recalled that name showing up on her phone once when she left it unattended. It wasn't someone anyone recognized. A background check revealed that Kyeven lived 2 towns over and worked as a truck mechanic. He had no prior criminal history, but neighbors, described him as reclusive, odd, and rarely seen outside. When questioned, Kyeven claimed he didn't know Dalene and denied ever being in Montrose. There was no evidence to dispute his claims, yet. The trail was cold, but something about his calm demeanor didn't sit right with investigators. They suspected he knew more than he was saying. They just didn't know how to prove it. Not yet. As days turned into weeks, the mystery surrounding Dalene Carlson's disappearance deepened. The town of Montrose remained on edge, especially students and staff at the university where she studied. Flyers were being removed due to weather, candles at vigils burned low, and leads had grown cold. The case had stalled, but something about Kyeven Dorell kept pulling detectives back. His name wasn't in Dalene's known circle, yet there it was, once logged in her phone weeks before she vanished. Detectives began to dig into his past more thoroughly, looking for any hint of connection. What they found began to raise questions no one was expecting. Kyeven Dorell had moved to the area a year prior. He rented a small house in a wooded part of Eldridge, a quiet community 30 miles away. He worked nights as a diesel mechanic at a roadside trucking depot and had no family nearby. Co-workers described him as efficient but antisocial. He kept to himself, took lunch breaks alone, and rarely joined in casual conversation. A deeper look into his background showed that Kyeven had changed his legal name 6 years ago after a brief stint in another state under a different identity, Bryce Callum. No charges, but several police reports linked to harassment complaints. From women. None had resulted in prosecution, but the pattern now seemed more than just coincidence. Detectives obtained a warrant to search public footage across Eldridge and the highways connecting it to Montrose. What they uncovered made their stomachs turn. One traffic camera on Route 39, time-stamped just an hour after Dalene left Timber Creek Bar, captured a vehicle resembling Kyeven's truck heading west, toward Eldridge. It was grainy, and the plates weren't readable, but the truck's dents and mismatched paint were identifiable to the trained eye. Another camera, near a gas station in Willow Junction, caught the same vehicle around 1:17 a.m. The truck paused, parked off camera for 20 minutes, then drove away. Still, no footage directly showed Dalene in the truck. They couldn't link her to the vehicle conclusively. It wasn't enough for a warrant or an arrest. Investigators then turned to Dalene's digital footprint again. Her phone had gone silent the night she vanished, but a forensic expert was brought in to extract hidden data. A chilling discovery surfaced. The phone had briefly pinged off a tower in the direction of Eldridge just after midnight, the night she disappeared. A brief signal, only minutes long, before it was shut off for good. The signal came from an area roughly 5 miles from Kyeven's rented house. Detectives decided to visit properties in that area, hoping for something, anything, that would tie him to her. One of the properties stood out, an old farmhouse and barn owned by a retired farmer named Edric Tannell. Tannell mentioned that he hadn't used the barn in years, but oddly enough, the old padlock had recently been replaced. He assumed kids had broken in and fixed it afterward. He gave the detectives permission to check it out. Inside, everything was still and cold. Empty feed bags, dusty crates, rusted tools. No immediate signs of Dalene, but on the side wall, partially hidden behind loose wooden panels, one officer noticed a modern trail camera, commonly used to watch wildlife or deter trespassers. It was strangely well kept, mounted securely, and angled toward the barn's central aisle. The memory card was gone, but investigators seized the device for further analysis. The tech team revealed that while the removable card had been wiped clean, the camera's internal storage, meant to serve as backup, was untouched. It would take days to recover the data, but everyone felt it in their gut. This camera might hold answers. In the meantime, investigators re-examined Kyeven's statement. He insisted he'd been working overtime the night Dalene vanished, but his supervisor revealed that he had actually called out sick. No one had verified his whereabouts. The alibi was false. When detectives returned to question him again, he remained calm, almost smug, and stuck to his story. But the lies were piling up. The digital trail, the past identity, the route of his truck, the false alibi, they were forming a circle around him. And soon, the camera footage would decide if it could be closed. The trail camera recovered from the abandoned barn was sent immediately to the state digital forensics lab. While investigators waited for the analysis, the anxiety among the team grew. No one said it out loud, but they were expecting to find something grim. The idea that Dalene Carlson had been led into that barn in the dead of night under unknown circumstances haunted everyone involved in the case. The location was remote, surrounded by thick woods and shielded from the main road. If someone wanted to hide a crime, this was the perfect place. 3 days later, the footage was finally retrieved. What they saw stunned even the most experienced officers. The first clips showed nothing unusual, just raccoons, birds, and wind shifting the door. Then, at 11:43 p.m. on the night Dalene disappeared, the camera recorded the sound of a vehicle approaching. Headlights appeared briefly as a truck pulled up in the distance. A man stepped out. Even in the grainy infrared footage, his build and posture were unmistakable. It was Kyeven Dorell. He walked around to the passenger side of the truck and opened the door. A figure stepped out slowly. It was Dalene. She didn't resist, but her body language was tense. Her hands appeared to be tied in front of her. Kyeven led her inside the barn. For several minutes, the camera picked up nothing but darkness and silence. Then, at 12:31 a.m., the footage resumed. Kyeven exited the barn alone. He was wearing gloves and carrying a large, rolled-up tarp. He walked back to the truck, placed the tarp in the bed, and then returned briefly inside. When he came out again, he was holding what appeared to be a shovel and a large flashlight. He walked around the side of the barn and disappeared from the camera's view. That was the final footage recorded that night. The rest of the camera's memory was filled with routine wildlife recordings from the following days. It was clear that whatever happened inside the barn, Dalene never walked back out. Investigators now had visual confirmation of Kyeven's involvement. They also had a timeline and probable location of the crime. The problem was, they still didn't have a body. And without that, it would be difficult to move forward with a murder charge. Prosecutors warned that a defense attorney could argue the footage only showed unlawful detention or even a staged interaction. But detectives weren't willing to wait. They believed Kyeven would eventually try to move or destroy more evidence now that the barn had been discovered. They returned to the property with a search team and began examining the area behind the barn where Kyeven had disappeared from camera view. The soil was uneven, disturbed in a way that didn't match the rest of the terrain. Cadaver dogs were brought in. One of them quickly picked up a scent and led officers to a patch of ground near a row of dying weeds. There, under nearly 2 feet of soil, they found the partially decomposed remains of a young woman wrapped in a plastic tarp. Nearby, buried under more dirt and branches, were several tools: a shovel, gloves, and a blood-stained cloth. The body was later confirmed to be Dalene Carlson through dental records. The autopsy revealed signs of blunt force trauma and ligature marks. Her time of death matched the timeline from the trail camera footage. The cause of death was officially listed as homicide. Now, detectives had everything they needed: the false alibi, the digital tracking, the recovered body, and, most importantly, the damning camera footage. All of it painted a clear and horrific picture of what had happened that night. Officers prepared to make their move. But rather than rush to arrest him, they decided to wait. They wanted to catch him in the act of returning to the scene. They believed he would try to retrieve or destroy evidence. Surveillance was placed on the barn, and a hidden camera was installed on the nearby tree line. Then they waited, quietly, patiently, knowing that justice was finally within reach. For 2 long nights, detectives maintained their surveillance on the old barn, hoping Kyeven Dorell would return to the scene of his crime. The area was kept under complete secrecy, with officers parked in unmarked vehicles tucked into nearby woods. Motion-sensitive cameras were installed, and every approach route to the property was monitored. The team knew from experience that killers often revisited their crime scenes, sometimes to relive the moment, sometimes to clean up, and sometimes to make sure the body was still hidden. After the body of Dalene Carlson was discovered and quietly removed, investigators left the gravesite appearing untouched, in case Kyeven had planned a return. On the third night, at 2:14 a.m., movement was detected. A truck, matching the one in Chimzi's the earlier trail footage, pulled up slowly with its headlights off. Kyeven stepped out, glancing around cautiously. He was wearing the same black hoodie and baseball cap seen in previous footage. He walked with a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a small toolbox in the other. Officers watched from a distance as he approached the barn door and unlocked it with a key he pulled from his pocket. Inside, he turned on a small light and began rummaging through an old cabinet. He was in the barn for nearly 15 minutes before he exited, returning to his truck and pulling out a gallon-sized canister. Investigators believed it was gasoline. That's when they made their move. Flashing lights lit up the night as several officers emerged from hiding, guns drawn. Kyeven froze for a moment, then bolted toward the tree line, dropping the canister in the grass. He didn't make it far. He was tackled to the ground by two officers and immediately placed in handcuffs. As he was taken into custody, he offered no resistance, no words, no emotion, just a blank stare into the darkness. At the police station, Kyeven refused to speak. He invoked his right to remain silent and asked for a lawyer. The search of his home and vehicle revealed more disturbing findings. In the back of his closet, police found a box filled with women's personal items, bracelets, lipsticks, phone cases, and even a student ID belonging to someone who had gone missing 3 years earlier in another state. Each item was carefully labeled with initials and dates. It became clear to investigators that Dalene Carlson was not his first victim. Detectives sent samples for DNA testing and reopened several cold cases that matched the pattern of young women disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Some of the missing had been briefly linked to Kyeven's previous identity, Bryce Callum, before he changed his name. The police now realized they weren't dealing with a man who acted on impulse. This was someone who had been practicing and perfecting his crimes for years. He chose isolated victims. He erased digital trails, he used secluded locations, and he never left witnesses. The district attorney prepared a comprehensive case, building charges for Dalene's murder, as well as new charges tied to the recovered evidence. But the prosecutors knew their strongest piece of evidence remained the trail camera footage. It not only placed Kyeven with Dalene, but also captured his actions step by step, including the disposal of her body. There would be no room for interpretation, no alternative explanation. The images told a story that words never could. In court, prosecutors revealed the footage in front of a packed room. Jurors watched in silent horror as the timeline of Dalene's final moments played out. The defense team tried to argue that the footage lacked audio and that Dalene had willingly accompanied Kyeven, but it was a weak narrative, shattered by the physical evidence, the false alibi, and the recovered items from other missing women. Kyeven sat motionless through it all, never once acknowledging the footage or the victim's family sitting just feet away. The trial lasted nearly 3 weeks, and when the jury returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty on all counts. Dalene's family wept in the courtroom. Justice had been served, but it had come at a terrible cost. And for investigators, the case was far from over. There were still other names, other items in that box, and other families who had been waiting for answers. Kyeven's secrets were beginning to surface. With the guilty verdict delivered, Kyeven Dorell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the final decision. There would be no appeals, no second chances, But as Dalene Carlson's family embraced and began the long road toward healing, investigators knew the case was far from closed. The contents of the box found in Kyeven's closet had opened the door to a darker, more complex truth. They were now dealing with what appeared to be a serial predator whose crimes stretched back years, maybe even decades. The labeled trinkets, carefully preserved and hidden, weren't just trophies. They were keys to the past, each item a thread, leading to a different story, a different life, a different unresolved nightmare. One of the items, a silver charm bracelet engraved with the name L.E., was matched through missing persons records to Lena Eastbrook, a 19-year-old student from New Mexico who vanished in 2017 while hiking alone. At the time, her disappearance was ruled inconclusive, with no suspects ever identified. But now, new forensic testing linked the DNA on the bracelet to Kyeven. It was undeniable. He had been there. He had taken her, too. Another item, a weathered phone case with a cracked unicorn design, belonged to Michelle Torrens, a 22-year-old barista who had vanished in Colorado during a cross-country bus trip in 2019. Her case had also gone cold, but cell phone tower records now revealed she had stopped briefly in the same city Kyeven had been working under his previous identity. With these new connections, federal investigators joined the case, expanding the inquiry across state lines. Soon, a pattern emerged. Each victim was young, independent, and had been traveling or temporarily isolated when they disappeared. None of them had a clear link to Kyeven, and in each case, he had managed to avoid detection. He changed names, used different vehicles, and worked under-the-table jobs that left few employment records. He was, by design, forgettable, an invisible predator. But with Dalene's case breaking the silence, those missing persons cases were now getting the attention they had long deserved. Back at the police department in Montrose, a special task force was formed. Their mission was to trace every place Kyeven had lived, worked, or visited. They revisited abandoned properties, re-examined unidentified remains, and contacted families who had long given up hope. In one case, a shallow grave found in Arizona in 2016, previously ruled accidental death, was reopened. A tooth fragment from the remains matched a missing college student from Utah. Kyeven had briefly worked at a gas station near the area under yet another alias. Despite the horror of these revelations, it was Dalene's case that remained the cornerstone. Her story had cracked the illusion of safety Kyeven had built for himself. It was a single error, a camera meant to record animals, that captured his crime. Without that footage, he might still be free, still stalking, still vanishing into the background. But he underestimated the one thing he couldn't control: technology. Behind prison walls, Kyeven remained silent. He refused to speak to reporters, refused interviews, and ignored letters from victims' families. Inmates who shared his cell, Block reported that he spent most days staring at the floor, unresponsive and withdrawn. It was as if he understood that his secrets had finally run out of places to hide. Dalene's family started a foundation in her name, funding surveillance technology in remote areas and supporting families of missing persons. Her mother often said that Dalene's case became the spark that lit the shadows, helping other victims be found, even after years of silence. Her story had given law enforcement a new template, one where no detail was too small, no trail too cold, and no camera too unimportant. Though the scars would never fully heal, the community of Montrose found a strange form of peace. The bars on Kyeven's cell weren't just a punishment. They were a wall keeping darkness locked away, proof that even the most calculating monsters could be brought down by truth, persistence, and a single unblinking eye in the night.